You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. It is me, your host, Haley Rawl. And if you are navigating a faith deconstruction yourself, or simply are fascinated by faith deconstruction journeys, by religion generally, and Mormonism specifically, then you are in the right place. Today, I got to sit down with the wise and articulate Tara Herbert, who shares her experience being a transracial adoptee into a Mormon family. She was actually placed for adoption through LDS Social Services, which is an arm of the Mormon Church that does adoptions like this. And she just shares a really important perspective about adoption, about growing up as a Black woman in Utah. She has so much to share, and there's so much that she said that I've really been sitting with and continually learning from. I'm just so appreciative of her coming and teaching me a lot of new things and just sharing her really valuable perspective. Welcome, Tara, to Girls Camp.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy this worked out. We've been talking for a while.
Yeah.
And then you happened to be in town, and now here we are.
I know. I can't get out of Utah.
Yes, I know. I'm sure no matter if your roots are here,
Yeah,
it brings you back. It brings you back.
Yeah.
Yes. Tara Herbert is here, and she's going to be sharing her story of growing up as a transracial adoptee. So you were adopted by a Mormon family as a child, grew up in Utah, and we're just going to kind of talk about what that was like and how, if, when that played into ultimately your faith deconstruction.
Yeah.
Much later on in life.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask is, what is your intention behind sharing your story? What do you hope for when you share this?
Yeah, I think that Mormons and ex-Mormons adopt a lot, probably a lot more than people realize. But I also think that there's mental health and trauma that is not talked about enough. And so for me now as an adult to be diving in and unpacking all of that, hopefully people, if you have adopted when you were Mormon and are now ex-Mormon, will get your kids the help sooner that they needed instead of making them have to figure it out as a adult, because it is a lot to unpack.
Yes, I think the adoption thing, I'm super excited that we're digging into that piece, because it does seem like, I don't know any statistics, but it does seem like maybe there seems to be a strong adoption culture in Mormonism. I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that being the case. I don't know if this is, again, I haven't looked up the statistics on this, but it seems like there's also a lot of transracial adoptions as well within Mormonism.
Yeah, I feel like there's a big misconception that just adoption in general in the US is pretty flawed. And a lot of people adopt just in general, but in specifically religion, they do it because they feel like kids need a good home and that they need God and a mom and a dad. And so there's that aspect that's pushing it to help kids, and which is noble. It's not a bad thing to want to help, but there's better ways to go about helping your community and the world than in my opinion adoption. My views on adoption now have definitely changed, and I'm sure they'll continue to change as I continue to uncover my own adoption kind of trauma and working through all of that. But I think within Mormonism, I do think there is a lot of transracial adoption, because I think there's a stigma that there's a lot of brown babies available, which is actually statistically untrue. The majority of kids who are adopted are white. If you're talking domestic adoption, majority, if they are interracial adoption, is Asian. So there's this idea that there's just a lot of poor single Black moms who need you to raise their kids.
Adopt and raise their kids.
Yeah. Which is just, I would say, probably leftover thinking and stigma from back in slavery time when Black children were taken from their mothers and family and separated like that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yes. I so appreciate you pointing out and I'm sure we'll get so much more into this along the course of your journey. And I'm curious to hear more about your current stance on adoption. But I'm sure so much of it traces all the way back, to your point, to the origins of America itself. And I think that, that's an interesting thing whenever I'm talking about Mormonism, because that's what I do. Obviously, I feel like there's always this societal level and there's, American history and that aspect of things. And then there's like the Mormon layer that usually kind of serves to just magnify, it seems like, a lot of what's already problematic in society.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, at least my non-Mormon friends, would consider Mormonism the most American religion.
Ooh, yeah.
And so it is steeped in some of those things that people hate talking about, which is racial issues and patriotic issues.
Totally.
And institutional issues.
Totally. Yes. I was thinking about that. I can't remember some TikTok rabbit hole I was down per usual, but just thinking about how so much of the branding of Mormonism is like, it's an American religion. It was started in America. Growing up Mormon, you learn the founding fathers were inspired by God to set up this country so that Joseph Smith could come and set up this religion. It's deeply American. So it makes sense. Yeah. Oh, same. Same. This year, it's funny because it was just the 4th of July. Yeah. This is July 6th that we're recording. I'm like, it feels a little tricky to be celebrating America. The more you learn, the more, the harder it is to just be like, go USA.
Yeah, there's more similarities too within Mormonism of just completely ignoring the bad and pretending like it's not there. And the same thing comes in with patriotism, right? Of this ignoring any of the bad and just pretending like it's all good. And so there's that similarity, of course, when it's more complicated and nuanced than that, and that's okay. That most things are. You know?
Absolutely. Let's start then with your story, the context of your Mormon upbringing. When were you adopted? And telling us about the family you were adopted into and how you were raised.
Yeah. So all of my siblings and I that were adopted as babies, right? Maybe days. I'm not even sure how old I was, but
basically a newborn.
Yeah. A newborn. And so 3 of us were adopted through LDS Social Services, which is very, very Mormon, right? They even set up their own adoption agency to be able to get babies into Mormon families. And then one of my brothers is adopted internationally from Korea. So in total, my parents had 7 kids. 4 of us are adopted, 3 are their biological children, and we're all kind of scattered throughout their biological children versus the adoption children.
Got it. So where are you in the lineup then?
I'm second to youngest. So there's how many above me? I can't even do math. A lot above me and 1 below me.
Yeah, because there's 7 kids in all?
7. So I'm 6th.
6th. Yeah, got it. So there's 5, you, and then you have 1 younger sibling.
Exactly.
Yeah. You joined a pretty big family already then too.
Yeah. So a lot of kids.
And you said that the adopted children are interspersed with the biological children. Is
I
that
guess
right?
To start, so my parents had 2 kids and then adopted my brother from Korea. Then they had another kid, and then the 3 of us were adopted after that.
Got it.
And none of us are biologically related, all from different parts of the United States. But my younger brother is black, full black, and then my older sister is black and actually part Native American white. She just found out. So I was adopted from Louisiana. My sister was adopted from Logan, Utah, from an actual Mormon woman, and my brother was adopted from Chicago.
Got it. And so the 3 younger adopted siblings, those were all through LDS Services, which is a church-run adoption agency.
Yeah. And, you'll hear of a lot of adopted moms in Utah. Like, Utah has statistically a pretty high rate of teen pregnancy. And so, if those kids aren't going to stay with their parents or go into foster care, those moms can be pressured to place their children for adoption.
Yeah. That makes sense given a lot of the cultural context, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times if teens get pregnant in Utah. It's a very pro-life culture.
Exactly.
So they're likely to carry those pregnancies to term, but then also probably likely to be encouraged to place children for adoption.
Yeah. And so even on the church's website now, you can go and read about adoption and their stance on adoption, which is very much, we believe, like the family proclamation that children should be raised by a mother and a father. And then they go into the statistics of single mothers and their children, which is pretty messed up because they never go into the statistics of adopted children, right? Of like, we are also a higher rate of incarceration, a higher rate of mental illness. So I don't know how many of those women, or my own biological mother, had she known the time, you know, in the 90s, that the statistics were kind of like not entirely better, you know,
Totally.
just different problems.
Yeah.
If she would have chosen that route.
Yeah, it's not the full picture,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And probably just not considering so many factors of, I wonder about how you gauge the like success rate of adoption
Exactly.
in that sense,
Yeah.
you know, because it's like, sure, in some ways there might be this benefit, but then in some ways there's probably this
Negative aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking through your TikTok and I loved something you said, which was you were talking about, and this is foreshadowing a bit in your story because you've since met your biological
Family. Mm-hmm.
And you said that you realized that your life as an adoptee was different, but not inherently better for being adopted.
Yeah. Which was like mind blowing to me, especially because at the time when I met my biological family, I was still very much Mormon. And so to see, I don't know, to walk into their house and be like, oh, you have a house. Oh, there's a bedroom for me over here. Or to see because I do have a biological brother that's 2 years older than me. I have a half brother that is, I don't know, 7 years younger than me. And to see that they're okay, like, and doing, not just okay, doing well. My younger brother has a full ride scholarship to LSU. My older brother is working and does really well for himself and has his child. To see my younger brother in private school and to see them doing okay, like in my head, my mom was like probably a teen mom, probably a drug addict, which was not at all the case.
Wow.
Not at all. She was not a teen mom. She was literally the same age as me as when I had my first child.
22.
22, yeah. And my biological father at the time was on trial for first-degree murder. He was acquitted though, and they already had one child together. He had mental illness, bipolar disorder, and they were planning on splitting, and there just wasn't enough support for her. She hadn't gone to school at this point, and so she felt like it would be better to place a child for adoption, and that would help me have a better life than to, you know, possibly go hungry for a little while. And that's probably the saddest part about it is like, you know, she made it out of that situation, and my situation of having a child at 22 was very similar. I was on Medicaid, I was on food stamps, and I think a lot of Mormons are. I don't know if it's talked about a lot, that like you literally essentially get married and descend into poverty.
You're so young, you get married quickly, oftentimes still in school, have kids very quickly.
Exactly.
Totally.
And some of the same mental health issues as well. It was like nothing was actually better. Like I've still repeated the same mistakes, but just didn't get to experience this biological part of myself in my upbringing.
Yeah, wow. It's so interesting to think about just the stereotypes and the stigmas, because you look at a young Mormon girl who gets married at 20 and has her first child at 21. And to your point, depending on the generational wealth, which oftentimes can come into play in those situations.
Yeah.
I mean, my husband and I, when we first got married, we had no money. We were going to school for free because the government was paying for it because of our income. But you think about the stereotypes and the stigmas that were probably placed on your mom in her situation, and how, to your point, those are really quite similar situations.
Exact same.
But yes, they are. But then these stigmas and these stereotypes that society puts on those, people view those very differently.
Yeah.
And thinking about, even if someone was a young Mormon, was getting divorced but was pregnant or whatever, you think there's probably a lot less likelihood that they would be encouraged to put up their child for adoption just because of those stigmas and those stereotypes.
Exactly. And I feel like those type of things too, we also like prey on in society, from adoption agencies, you know, telling them that like, yeah, you can't do it. I just specifically remember reading an article on LDS social services that like children just need like love and two parents. And as beautiful as that is, it's like children need a lot more than love and a lot more than just two parents. They need parents who are good parents and to still love and accept them. Like, you can have two parents and they can be the worst people in the world. That doesn't change anything because you have two parents. And I feel like that stigma of single moms, I don't know, it not only was it put on my mother to push her to want to do adoption, but it kind of I felt that pressure and scared to become a single mom. Like, I was terrified in high school of getting pregnant. And what added insult to injury is that I also didn't know how it really all worked. So I'm literally constantly, I heard you talk about on the Mormon stories.
Oh yeah,
that
with Courtney Kimble.
Yeah, that you're like, you don't know how it works. So you're like buying pregnancy tests. I literally was going to Planned Parenthood and getting Plan Bs for blowjobs.
Yes.
Like,
without actually
wild.
having had sexual intercourse.
Yeah. And it's like wild how we all we think that and don't actually know how it works, when it would have been more helpful, because for me personally, it was curiosity along with hormones. But when I realized how it all worked, you kind of like take a step back and think like, am I ready for this?
Yes.
Can I do this? You know?
And you have the knowledge to, if you do choose to do it, protect yourself from STDs
Yeah.
and pregnancy, etc. Okay, there's so many more questions I have in my head. I'm glad we talked about that piece of it, because I think that gives really good insight into, I mean, at that point you were a baby, but kind of what was probably going on for your mother at the time and your biological family at the time when you were placed for adoption. Let's get into now what it was like being raised with the Mormonism of it all, with the Utah of it all, because you lived in South Jordan and Utah. What was it like as a child being in that environment?
Yeah, I would say like the home, very loving. I still love, of course, my parents and my siblings. Super loving, loved being in a big family, loved that aspect. But I would say that my home was also very safe because there was other Black kids. I had an Asian brother, you know, it was a very safe place to be raised in and feel comfortable to be like, at least when they're in home, there's people like me. Very, very Mormon, right? We were the typical FHE family every single Monday night, scripture study every single morning, always going to young men's, young women's. My parents are very involved even to this day, where it's like Sundays are like a marathon of stuff that they're doing and helping people. And I loved the neighborhood that I grew up in. Like, I loved it. A lot of it was really, I would say, looking back, blissful for a childhood. I think also now with a little bit more context, I can understand some of the turmoil I was also going through, you know, in adoption. And especially back then, I'm not sure how common or if things have changed much now. Most adoptions were closed. So that means that you don't have any contact with your biological family. You don't know who they are. You could literally be walking down the street and pass someone you're related to,
and you'd have no idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so there was definitely a lot of questioning. And this year was the first year that I feel like I really saw myself. They call it genetic mirroring. When you see yourself in your parents, it helps form an identity and your view of self, which you probably especially know because you have twins. So they see themselves in each other every single day and in you every single day. And so I remember it's almost like dissociating when you look in the mirror and think, what do I look like? Do I look, and it's weird for me to try and describe. It's like, I know I'm not like ugly, but I don't know what I look like. I don't know who I look like, whatever.
No, that makes so much sense. I mean, it's something I take for granted, not having that experience.
Yeah.
But yes, I can only imagine how isolating that would feel to wonder whose mannerisms might these be, or my eyes look a certain way and why, you know, where when you are growing up in your biological family, it's like, oh, I have hairy legs like Aunt Rebecca, or I have that, you know, even silly things like that. You feel like you have those connection points that I think do help you. I mean, obviously help you form a sense of self.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that forming that sense of self would have probably felt much more difficult in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I don't think I never realized that I didn't really have a sense of self for so long until like even this year, really, to really like be like, whoa, my oldest son really looks like me. Like he really looks like me. And thinking all growing up, like, I wonder what my parents look like. I wonder who they are. You know, people used to tell me, you look like Brandy Norwood, who is actress, and Ray J, I don't know, the sex tape with Kim.
Oh.
That's his sister.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
But people would tell me, you look so much like her. And I'm like, maybe that's my mom. Maybe she.
Yeah.
And people would be like, you look like Kobe Bryant. I'd be like, maybe that's my dad. Like, who knows? But trying to think of like, who would my family be, and thinking, oh, of course it wouldn't be them, because like my family's probably just like, you know, drug addicts or some horrible situation. And I will say, even if your parents are drug addicts, you deserve to meet them and know what they're like, regardless of whatever situations they're in.
My dad had substance abuse problems my entire life.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking too, which I'm sure we'll also get to, but your original point when you're talking about adoption is ultimately mothers should not be put in a position where where they feel like that's their only option, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this theoretical drug addiction thing, though that was not the case with your family. My dad was fully a drug addict, but my mom had luckily resources to lean on because of our extended family and because of, you know, socioeconomic factors. And it's not like we didn't have our struggles in our own way, but I'm just thinking about how it's ultimately a systemic failure, right? And just going kind of back to those stereotypes again, here you are growing up maybe having this idea, well, I was placed for adoption because my biological family, they're all drug addicts or whatever. And it's like, I was a Mormon girl and my dad was fully addicted to drugs as well. But there's just it's such a different way of handling that.
Yeah.
And also just that feels like it would be a hard and sad thing as a child to think, well, my family must just be drug addicts. And, you know, that was something that maybe you were internalizing from how people spoke about whatever, where like my dad was a drug addict, but I still, do you see what I'm saying? Like,
it was just it's like nobody would think that like your dad's a drug addict, so we will take Haley, and
exactly,
she doesn't get to be raised with him.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that with your dad, you have a ton of lovely memories and bad that you wouldn't trade just because he's a drug addict. You know, it's like you're happy that you have known him in all of the good and bad, because we're not all bad and we're not all good. Even if he is a drug addict, like there's parts of him that you're like, I'm so happy I knew him, you know?
Exactly. And I feel lucky that I was able to have that despite that.
Yeah.
And to your point, some people can't because if they do have drug addiction, for example, then there's no resources in place or systems in place that they can get help and then maintain relationships with their children, for example. Okay, so you're saying growing up, really ideal in a lot of ways. I think that's a very similar, very common sentiment that many of us look back and are like, there are some ideal things, but in retrospect, when you're putting it in context, like you said, you kind of see some of those more underlying issues.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your teenage years. So you were kind of mentioning that it sounds like there was some flirting with the boundaries, obviously with like sexual things and things like that. Kind of just paint a picture for us what it was like being a teenage girl in South Jordan. Is it South Jordan? Or,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I always
South
get
Jordan.
South and West because there's both. But
Yeah.
what it was like being a teenage girl.
Yeah.
For
We
you.
just, very much like, I feel like my friends and I would laugh like, we're just like sojo hoes. Because it feels like even if you kiss somebody when you're too young versus like getting more sexual, that you're already categorized as a hoe,
Totally.
right?
Yep.
And so
Unfortunately,
you
yes.
can either reclaim the word and be like, whatever about it. So I never felt, I guess, shame in myself for being curious. Okay, well, maybe I did feel shame, but I also like the curiosity was higher than the shame because we all, I think in teenage years, you're trying to figure yourself out. You're trying to figure everything out. And for me, I feel like dating was really hard because I constantly was told by different people that I'm not interested in black girls or I'm not attracted to black girls, or they would over-sexualize you thinking that you like literally just because I'm black that I'm already a hoe, right? And I'll do anything with you. Luckily, I had really great group of friends, but we were all trying to figure it out. Some were Mormon, some weren't. And so we kind of were, playing both sides of like, like we just love being able to go to parties and like laugh and just, girlhood.
Yes. Be teenagers.
Yes. And figure it out on our own. And like some friends were very much more open with their parents about, even though they were Mormon, they're like, yeah, I'm having sex and I do not care that you know, and like this is just it. I was never that way. I felt like I had to hide everything. I don't even know to this day if my parents know how actually like of a bad, I say in quotation marks, teenager I was, because I just couldn't talk to them about any of that type of stuff.
Why not? Was there just an expectation that you would be following the Mormon rules? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think it's just like, even for some of my siblings, like my older siblings, my parents would be like, if you go all the way through high school without swearing, we'll pay you this much money, And then not being able to differentiate your family rules between church rules was really hard for me. So I just assumed like if it's against what the church teaches, then it's against what my family would be okay with. And then the added stigma, right, of being like, I'm really interested in this kind of stuff, but like assuming that I'm just going to become a teen mom, because I'm flirting with that line was something I just like didn't want to talk about. And we didn't talk openly about sex, drugs, alcohol. I think it was just assumed that none of us would be interested in that type of thing. But if you feel like a misfit, that's where misfits go, right? You all group together, and if you're gonna be bad, then be bad together.
Yeah, it's like the counterculture, right?
Yeah.
If you feel like you don't fit into the culture, then it makes sense that you're going to find other people who don't, and then kind of maybe push even more against those like cultural boundaries
Exactly.
or rules or
Yeah.
things like that. I'm curious about the kinds of messages you were getting at church at that stage of your life. Going to church, the things that you were learning, if there's any stories that come to mind or experiences or just a general overview of what it felt like to be going to church, whether that was around adoption or blackness or really anything, just what the church experience specifically was like.
Yeah, I would say like in just like the area that we lived, there was a lot of transracial adoptees. And I feel like my parents really did like have us meet with other transracial adoptees. There's a segment of like Mormonism called Genesis that is like Black Mormon church that meets every fast Sunday that we would go to very often, because a lot of it was white parents who had adopted Black kids. And so we'd go there as well. I guess my ideas and what I felt like was like racism was over. Our transracial adoption proved that. And that any of the uncomfortable feelings that I was feeling when kids would call me the N-word, or just now what I would know as microaggressions, I didn't realize that those were things that were happening and why I was feeling like, I think a lot of people from my high school would be like, yeah, I know who she is, because I never had felt like I fit in anywhere. And I don't think my friends would be like, what? Like, you don't fit in? It's like I was always jumping from like group to group to group to group because I just felt like trying to find my place. And then somebody would say a joke like, if it's dark out, right? Oh, we can't see Tara. And it's like, okay, I'm done with this friend group. And then I'm done with this friend group. And then I'll go back to this friend group. So it was very, I don't know, just
transient, trying to find your place.
Yeah.
And you mentioned people would call you the N-word. Was that jokingly or casually or as...
Yeah.
Regardless, that's absolutely awful.
It was definitely jokingly in their head, I guess. But it didn't feel even, I don't know, like I've been called the N-word jokingly and I've been called it seriously. And there's, not much difference in the feeling and
totally
being called it. So
the impact is the same. Yeah. I can only imagine the just sheer amount of microaggressions, especially because you said you're 29.
Yeah.
So when did you graduate high school?
In 2013.
Okay. So we were the same graduating class, right? Yes. I'm 2013. And I even look back on that era and just think, hopefully there's been a lot of progress from my vantage point, just around general understanding around race. And I just think about when I was going to high school, just how much less understanding there was then, and just how inappropriate a lot of the behaviors were and things people said. And who knows, I don't know exactly what it's like now in like a high school setting, but I'm sure there was not only those microaggressions, but also, to your point, there was kind of this mentality of it wasn't a big deal, probably.
Yeah. And like kids, like some of the most popular kids in school had these big old trucks with their Confederate and American flags. And I feel like people jokingly used to think South Jordan is like kind of this hick just because there's a lot of like 4-H stuff.
It's more rural.
Yeah. And now it's like a huge city. But at the time when I was growing up, it was definitely way more rural. And I didn't realize how much like open land and stuff there was. I thought it was kind of normal to travel 15, 30 minutes to go to your grocery store. But now realizing like, oh yeah, it was more of a small town feel probably.
Yes, which unfortunately can lend itself to more regressive ideologies and things like that as well.
And you wonder, like, I guess that none of us were just even talking about this. Like, like the parents that were just like, yeah, that's cool. Put a Confederate flag up there. That's awesome. Like, so obviously they're not talking to their kids about racial issues. My parents aren't talking to me about racial issues.
Yeah, no one's talking about it. Was it ever talked about in church? Did you ever internalize messages at that point about your race or about maybe being adopted?
I didn't, because I always, like, even in the Book of Mormon, when it's like talking about dark skin, like, or the Lamanites, I was always like, oh yeah, that's like Native Americans. Thank God it's not me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because that's kind of what, in the Book of Mormon, for those who don't know, it talks about a curse of blackness. Is that the exact wording? I can't remember. Either blackness or darkness, but on the Lamanite people, who were a people in the Book of Mormon, which basically is saying that people who were sinful were cursed with brown skin. Yeah. So it was more connected in that doctrinal sense with brown or like indigenous people. Yeah, that's interesting to think too. I mean, I'm a white person, obviously, but how much power there is in just normalizing kind of awful things where it doesn't trigger the way you think it would, because you're sitting in a lesson, you learn that thing about Lamanites, for example, and everyone around you is just like, so you're like, okay, I guess this is normal. Like, it's sometimes looking back, it's like, how did I not realize how terrible that was? But you just don't realize when everyone else around you is just kind of like going with it too, And
I don't think church history, like for Black members, was not a thing that I knew. So of course I didn't internalize it because I just didn't know about it. So maybe it would have been different if I had known about it, but I truly did not know that Black members didn't have the priesthood till 1978 or could go through the temple for saving ordinances in Mormonism. I didn't know that Jane Manning was sealed to Joseph Smith as his eternal servant. Didn't know that Green Flake was a slave that was traded as tithing in Utah when they came here. So had I probably heard those things, it would have probably changed my mind. I don't know. A lot in Mormonism for me it felt like a struggle, right? To live this way because I just wanted to like have fun. I just wanted to live life and not have to worry about sinning and all of those type of things. And so I would say as a teenager, it felt like it wasn't a good fit, but a lot of the kids in my ward, we were all doing the same thing. And then you kind of like clean up and go on a mission and get on the right path, you know? And so maybe parents did know about it and they were like, they'll figure it out. Like they'll figure it out.
Yeah, they'll get there eventually. Yeah, that is another thing that I think is quite common. I mean, you talk to plenty of people who grew up Mormon and they were just really good Mormons as teenagers. But I think a lot of people as Mormon teenagers, it's just very restrictive.
Yeah.
And that's a time of development and exploration. And it seems almost inevitable for a lot of us that there's not some type of friction when you're in such a restrictive religion that's puts a lot of shame and punishment around those types of what I think are very normal developmental milestones. And I'm speaking now specifically around sex. Perhaps that comes in for some people around experimenting with drugs or alcohol or what have you. You did go on a mission.
Yeah, I did.
So you did the thing. You cleaned up and went on a mission.
I did it. Yep.
And let's talk about that. Where did you go? What led you to decide to go on a mission if you were kind of experiencing that friction as a teen already?
Yeah, I would say my patriarchal blessing mentioned that I would serve a mission. And of course, like the idea of going somewhere would be awesome, right? To like go foreign or different things. But for me, it also scared me because I feel like the realities of missions was never like, you know how they try and paint it in such a beautiful picture? That was never something like an illusion that I got, you know, especially when I saw like sister missionaries and the ghetto, like absolute horrifying clothes that they were wearing.
So bad.
Just trash bags, basically,
Yep.
that they wore.
And flats.
And yeah, it just didn't seem appealing to me at all. But I feel like I had made a promise to God that like if they lower the mission age, I'll go on a mission because I didn't feel prepared to go to high school. And I think this is just an aspect of...
To college, you mean?
Yeah, college. Yeah. And an aspect of Mormonism is like, really, if you're a woman in Mormonism, I don't know. Like, I feel like you have to have things figured out for yourself because nobody's going to help you. If you want to go to college and stuff, like you have to be very ambitious to be able to reach that goals versus someone who it's like, I just don't know if that's like something I can do, you know, like, cause I didn't feel like a studious student. I graduated, you know, C's, get degrees, but I just was like, I don't know really what I want to do with my life. And so motherhood and going that route is like the identity that I took on because I was like, well, I don't know if I'm smart enough to go do anything else. So I know I love babies, so motherhood will be it. And so the best thing to prepare me for motherhood would be going on a mission.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of an element of like, let's kill some time.
Yeah.
And
so true. I was not ready to get married.
Yeah, let's kill some time and then come home and hopefully get married at that point.
Yeah.
That's interesting about thinking about college too, because it makes sense that at that phase of life, were you to maybe have encouragement or more tangible help to kind of help you figure that out, maybe your path would have been different. But without that, it's kind of like, okay, well, I'll go on a mission and then try and get married and have kids when I come back, because that's also just what so many people are doing. It kind of just seems like one of the most viable options for that phase of life.
Yeah, and there was girls in my seminary class who were already engaged before high school was over.
Wow. At
So-
18
Yeah. So they would have been, 17 or 18 when they got engaged.
as high school students.
2 grown returned missionaries. Yeah.
No way.
Wild. And so that was like terrifying to me to think that I'm just going to go get married and pop out babies. And the ones that I do know who did that are now divorced. So
That's so young to be making that decision.
yeah. And so I went to Atlanta, Georgia. I felt comfortable with that. I was always scared to go somewhere foreign. I know that's everyone's like dream to go foreign, but I had cousins that were female who had gone foreign, and the experience just sounded really horrifying to me. And so I was happy to go somewhere in the United States and not have so much of my life change. Like it's like already I would say my mission was very much the most cult experience I don't know how you could say it's not in that experience with how much control is going on. I can't imagine doing that in a completely different country, learning a different language.
Yeah, it does add a layer of, to your point about cultness, when you're so far away from home.
Yeah.
I think it does kind of almost up the level of cult feeling because you're extra isolated. And so you're extra desperate.
Yes.
So you kind of cling on even more. But I do think sometimes that stateside missions, they seem more strict to me in a lot of ways. It depends, actually. It completely depends on the mission president.
Yeah.
I served in Germany, and my mission president was more on the lax side.
Yeah.
My sister served in Chile, and her mission president was one of the more strict ones I've ever heard. But I do feel like stateside mission presidents tend to run a really tight ship as far as rules and things go.
Yeah, mine definitely did. I mean, and it's like sometimes just like some of this is so when people like compare like how strict, it's like all of it is just,
It's a good point. It's all crazy.
It's like,
what are we comparing here?
Yeah, it's like, can you listen to Disney music or can you
Yeah,
not?
it's a
Like,
good point.
what's the toss up? But maybe it does feel that way too because you are in the United States, and so you do have access to more access to things, you know, than someone who would not be in the United States. So maybe it feels like it has to be strict because sometimes it can turn into, it's mostly men. So I would say sometimes it could turn into a frat house.
Yeah,
you know,
totally. If it's not, I always say the mission rules appeal to the very least common denominator.
Yeah.
And then us poor sisters are like, we could be handling ourselves like much better without all these rules. But some of the elders, I think, actually do unfortunately need those type of rules.
Yeah.
I mean, no one needs them because they're all crazy, but yeah, totally. What was it like being a missionary? What was your mission experience like generally?
I would say generally horrible. Wish I wouldn't have done it. If I'm being honest, I feel like my mission is such a huge turning point in my story of Mormonism because it's what started like really the full orthodoxy of it for me was going on a mission. And I think that's what most Mormon parents hope, is that that's what it does. And it did that for me. And I also experienced just extremely unsafe situations. You know, in Mormonism, we believe the gospel's for everybody, and it really is not. And so that means even if somebody is extremely racist, you know, in our little heads, we think it's going to be okay. Confederate flag, like, it's probably fine. Just memorabilia, not memorabilia. Do not go to the houses that have Confederate flags if you're black, you know?
So you didn't feel like you could keep yourself safe because of this mentality of we have to teach everybody.
Exactly.
So even if there's obvious literal red flags, the Confederate flag, we still need to approach this person because the gospel's for everyone.
Yeah. And typically I think in the South, they'll say like, well, if somebody has a Confederate flag, they're probably just a bunch of nice country boys. And I would say that is true if you're white. My bias, you know, it's not like I went knocking on a lot of those doors. It happened twice where it was absolutely horrible. And that was enough to create a very strong bias. So it's not that I'm trying to be like, you're awful if your family, you know, in Georgia, there's legitimate people where their family were in the Confederacy, but it's just weird to celebrate, you know, like the Nazis don't somebody who has Nazis in their family, they don't celebrate
Yeah,
that.
no, it's objectively problematic, at least in my
Yeah.
opinion. Although, yeah, I mean, I don't know much about the state culture of Georgia, but to your point, it's some people are more easily able to say, oh, they're just celebrating tradition, where it's
Yeah.
like, well, what does that tradition mean? Or the fact that
Tradition
they're
of racism.
exactly,
Yeah, it's like,
and slavery.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, okay, but why should anyone be celebrating that tradition? So you had some pretty bad experiences.
yeah. And I feel like in Georgia, like it's such a love-hate relationship for me, because there was also people who were so genuinely nice and genuinely concerned about my well-being, more so than I had enough mental knowledge to understand kind of how unsafe I was, you know? And so I genuinely appreciate those people. And I think even people on the streets who were Black, that was the first time I felt this camaraderie among, you know, Black Americans who were like, why are you in this religion? Why are you doing this? Don't you know this? And that's when they started telling me the facts about the Mormon church and how it used to be. And that doesn't negate any of the Black members who are still Mormon, but you should know those facts to be able to make that decision for yourself, if it's going to be a good fit for you or not.
Absolutely. So you ended up on your mission by meeting other Black Americans. You ended up learning about the problematic history of
Yes.
Black people in the Mormon church.
That's when I was first introduced to like Bruce R. McConkie, the fence sitter doctrine that Black people in the pre-existence couldn't decide whether they wanted to choose God's plan or Satan's. And so that's why they were cursed with a skin of darkness and not given the priesthood for so long. And it's like anytime I'd ask people questions, or the curse of Cain, right? And that's specific to Mormonism, which I did not know that Mormonism believed that Canaan, who killed his brother Abel, that has put the curse on all of Black people, that we have this curse, and that's why we couldn't have the priesthood. Different things like that. I had no idea. And when I try to ask questions or like be like, what the heck is this, like something we still believe? Because that was the issue for me at the time, was just like, if we don't believe this, then like where's the counter to openly say that like this isn't a belief? It was on my mission when the first presidency drafted a letter saying that Black people didn't have the curse of Cain. That was in 2014 when that was addressed. There's obviously a problem if they have to say a letter letting people know that like we don't have the curse of Cain.
Yes. And to your point, it's just the MO of the church, right? They do this with every terrible, problematic thing that's been taught in the past, and oftentimes the very recent. And I mean, these things are, I think, still taught in other ways, more subtle, but they never just say, that was wrong, period. We are very sorry for the very real harm that caused, period. It's always also these types of letters they send out. It's always these weird kind of, they just want it to fade away.
Placate, yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, to your point, it's never like, okay, well then can we address why was that ever said in the first place?
Yeah.
If that was apparently a called revelator of God, it just raises all sorts of questions. But I do think the church has just been pretty objectively terrible about taking accountability for the racist things that were said and promoted in the past.
Yeah. And it's like when there is no, I mean, it's hard to change a culture of things, you know? And I think it's even harder when you don't directly just come out and say like, yeah, that was something that was taught in the past, but we don't agree with it. And here's what we're doing to try and alleviate that, because I don't think that letter would have been drafted if there was not a real problem going on among members.
Totally.
With racial issues going on. And they're still going on. And I feel like in Mormonism, again, it's like we turn this blind eye and be like, do we have to talk about race again? Do we have to, like, I'm so tired of hearing about race. And it's like, yeah, I'm tired of living this way as well. Like, I'm
Totally.
tired of feeling like I have to second guess whether that was something that was racist that they were doing or just ill intentions. Like, I'm tired of living that way too. So
Yeah.
maybe if you could just listen and understand a minute to what I'm saying, then it would help to further that so you don't have to be so annoyed about talking about race.
Also, I would counter race is hardly touched on really at
that's true.
all. Like, I feel still to this day, and I think there's still a huge problem in ex-Mormonism too. But I feel still ill-equipped. And it wasn't until it was a little bit before Black Lives Matter, I joined this book club and I started reading more literature. I read, why can I not remember the name of the book? Anyway, it was pretty much my first encounter with race, any sort of like critical race theory.
Yeah.
And it completely upended. I had never really thought about it, to be honest with you. And I grew up as a white girl in Provo, Utah, as a Mormon. I just don't feel like race was ever really talked about in these settings of actual education. I mean, obviously we talked about slavery and the Civil War and stuff, but even that was not nearly as comprehensive as it should be, nor did we talk about the implications of that still to this day. And I still feel like I'm majorly catching up because it was just not talked about, and it's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Especially as we were discussing when Mormonism is steeped in racist history.
Yeah.
America is steeped in racist history. Like, we got to talk about it.
Yeah.
Of course we have to talk about it. These things are not just going to like magically disappear. And then, yes, to your point, when it is occasionally spoken of, people act like bothered or tired by it.
Yeah. And like the Black Lives Matter movement really opened my eyes to a lot of things, because again, still living kind of like, oh, these racial issues are over. But when I was on my mission, Trayvon Martin was shot and there were riots in downtown Atlanta. And again, not having any, in that regard, like we were raised the same of not, I still feel the same way. And I am Black, of trying to figure out all of this because I just didn't get that context of like, oh, why are people like being funny, And during the Black Lives Matter movement, when my husband and I lived in Idaho and he was denied service at a store, and it's hard for people to understand when it absolutely has to do with your race. It's so hard to prove. It's like sexism, right? It's so hard to like prove unless somebody's just outright
Yes.
being sexist or being racist, that was the reason,
Oh, yeah. It's such a mind fuck because you're like, I know, I can feel that this is what it's about. But it's so true. Like, I experience this with sexism. That's how I can relate to that, where it's like, this feels like you're asking me to take notes because I'm a woman.
Yeah.
But it's like, but you don't even feel like you can say that because then it's like, well, maybe it's not or whatever. Maybe I'm being sensitive or whatever. You explained that so well of just feeling like it's probably confusing too, because especially when you're growing up and you don't have all that context, but you're feeling
I felt
icky.
it. Yeah, my whole life I felt it.
Yeah, but you don't have these words to describe, or even everyone around you is just kind of like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like, that's not a thing anymore.
They're just joking.
Yeah. As you're learning those things, also, by the way, for anyone listening, I'll link some articles. I think you mentioned green flake, like those things that you mentioned, I'll link some articles so people can read up on that if they want to. But as you're learning those things as a missionary, what's that like? Like, are you starting to question the truth of the church? Like, what's that doing to your faith?
Yeah, I think it was just a lot of anger. Like, I had anger towards my parents, and then wondering, I still don't know. I've never had a conversation if they knew those things or not. Anger at the church, but also the internal turmoil because it's hard to kick belief. Still believed it was true. I just thought that like, man, this is such a shitty, hand to be dealt, you know? And it played more into the like, thank God you were adopted so you didn't have to, you know, live like these Black people, because it's so awful to be Black. And so I kind of, I don't know, I think it had the opposite effect of making me be like, well, I am going to be the best Black member, and I am going to be the change where we actually talk about these things. And that's, yeah, I think that's a lot of members feel that way.
It's so
about
real. Yeah, it's a part of, I want to draw a diagram sometime, but for so many of us, it's like we learn some of these things, but then it's like, it does bring a renewed conviction almost of like, okay, well, now you have this righteous indignation against a big part of the church, but you're like, okay, I'm going to be the change. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to address this and improve the church from the inside. Yeah, I think that's a very common phase for a lot of people. Let's talk about getting home from the mission and the next steps of your life, because you got married fairly quickly thereafter.
Yeah, probably the year after I got home, got married. My husband and I met at singles ward. We were, I don't know, singles ward was like also super hard for me because I also felt like I didn't want to get married, because I felt like at that time, now I'm a return missionary. So anybody who I date, I have to tell them all my dirty deeds and lay it on the floor, you know? And so now I have like 2 strikes against me because I'm Black and I am a whore. So that was not incredibly fun. And then when I met my husband, well, I was really smitten and in love. I think both of us were. He is also half Black. And I feel like maybe there was some camaraderie there. He also had a very hard mission. And at the time, he was not active. He wasn't an active member. And so, I don't know, I put on my little missionary hat and was like, let's get back into this so that we can get married. But we did end up sleeping together before we got married, which was a nightmare, I think, for most returned Mormon missionaries to feel like you're in, because it's like the psychological stress of being like, oh my gosh, like now I really am a whore because I've lost my virginity before marriage. Something that I was trying so hard to protect. You know, I always skirted with the line, but never went fully. The other part of it was also that it was so wonderful and amazing and safe and great, but we had to deal with the aspect of it, of the repentance, you know, to be able to get to the temple.
Yeah, it's so sad because it's like the sex itself could be absolutely wonderful and exactly when you would have chosen to do it yourself. But then it's so immediately coupled with the most intense shame and disappointment and failure that it's just so unfortunate that what could be just like a really lovely bonding sexual experience is made into something else. Yeah. And the repentance process, what was that like? Did you tell your bishop or whomever at the time?
Yeah, I can't remember if we told them before. I feel like we had talked to our singles ward bishop before, like telling our family and stuff. So that was an interesting process, just because I was just like, yeah, like I sinned, like I just need to repent. And it's like, of course they want to know, well, is this like full on sex or not? And my husband was like threatened with excommunication because he was a return missionary.
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah.
They'll threaten you with excommunication if you've had sex.
Yeah,
as
so
a return missionary.
They wanted to do a disciplinary council for him to decide if it should decide how intense of discipline it should be. Wow. They didn't end up doing that just because both of us moved wards and were so, you know, transient at the time. But yeah, they said that that would be like a possibility. And I don't know if it's something to like get you to stop, because I think in Mormonism, it's like, well, once you get started, like you can't stop. And some of that aspect is true, because I feel like once you've found your person and learned that like, wait, sex isn't that scary. And like, wow, like I actually feel more confident. Like I remember my friends in high school who were having sex and how confident they were with themselves. I'm like, oh, because it feels good to know your sexuality and to express it how you want to express it.
Exactly, to make the decision for yourself.
Yeah.
I also think I didn't have sex until Bentley and my husband got married, but I remember the first time having sex just being like, oh, it's so lovely and wonderful, but it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
You know? And
Yeah.
it is a big deal. In one way, it is a huge deal in a lot of ways, but I guess my point was like nothing crazy magically happens
Yes,
where it's like it's just not a big deal. Like two grown adults consensually having sex is just not a big deal. And I think probably once you actually full on have sex, you're kind of just like, okay, like no lightning bolt came out of the sky.
Yeah.
Like this is
And we want to get married. It was at that point that I was just like, this is the person I want to marry. And what is the difference between a marriage certificate and committing to each other, which we had done, you know,
Yes.
This is a commitment. We want to be together for the rest of our lives. And I don't see how a marriage certificate changes that at all.
just like a technicality.
Yeah, because the commitment's more important than the certificate.
Exactly.
But it was, I don't know, and it was so embarrassing, like, to have to tell our parents, and like, I don't know how I survived that.
Yeah. That sounds not fun.
Yeah, and like, probably the most embarrassing part about it is like when we decided to tell our parents was because my mother-in-law had walked in the morning after. So awkward. Like, I don't know if
So you had to explain it.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was like I don't know. It was so, I was like, I don't think we can actually get married. I can never come back here again.
Yeah, just family dinner. You're like, hey.
Yeah.
It's also just so infantilizing
I was 21.
You were 21, which in my opinion is too young to get married. I got married at 20.
Yeah.
But it's not too young to have sex.
Yeah.
So it's like so silly. It's so twisted because they're encouraging you to get married, which probably most of us shouldn't have done at that age.
Yeah.
But then they're so discouraging you to have sex when it's like, that's not a big deal at that age to be having, again, consensual, responsible sex.
Yeah.
It's just all very, very twisted.
And my husband was 23. And now looking back, I cannot imagine policing my kids' sexuality. Like, it's just, I don't want no parts.
Yeah, no, like
in it.
you do your thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And please, like, I don't want to know details. Like,
Seriously. And to your point, like, there's just so much, even the fact that the future mother-in-law walked in that next morning, it's because you're having to do it in these weird situations. It's just like the whole thing, it just makes it weirder than it needs to be.
yeah.
Did you end up getting married in the temple?
We ended up getting married at the governor's mansion. We got married civilly first, and then got sealed in the temple later. And even that, I felt so ashamed that I just kind of was like, yeah, whatever, to whatever my sisters or mom said of like, or my husband's mom said to the wedding, just because, and I feel like they really tried. Part of me also wished I would have worn a dress without garments, because I was like, oh, now I'm like out in the open. Like, it felt so freeing to like tell family that we're not gonna get married in the temple and it's okay, you know. But then it's like, oh, but you're still Mormon. And I didn't realize that until, you know, leaving Mormonism, that like, oh, it wasn't the aspect of the having sex, it's the freedom to be like, I'm going to live my life how I want to live it.
Absolutely. I'm going to get married in the dress I want to get married in, and I'm going to make my own decisions about sex. Yeah, that's a really good distinction. It's not the sex itself, it's the decision making and how that was stripped from us, and all the way down to something as maybe seemingly small as like the dress you're wearing on your wedding day. Like, that's it. We just didn't have a lot of choice in a lot of things. I'm saying we, but I didn't feel that way. It sounds like you didn't feel that way either. Let's talk about when you had your first child. From what you've told me, it sounds like that was kind of where faith started to get really shaky for you. Is that correct? Is that kind of when you would say you started like really questioning things?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely correct. When I had my first child, it was such a traumatic experience. And I think that this can be common among a lot of adoptees when you've never had a biological relationship ever, and then your child being that first biological relationship. It's very common, which I did not know, to not feel a bond or immediate connection for a while. And not even that I didn't feel a bond or immediate connection, but I felt like it wasn't my child. Like it was a surreal feeling to be like, is it mine, to a level of like, I know we all go home from the hospital like a little bit like it feels surreal already that it is your child, but it was like, I just was not in a good mental health space to be able to feel that connection.
And you were 22?
22.
So
yeah.
it was within a year of marriage you got pregnant.
Yeah, 3 months after I got married.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I got pregnant, and so had a baby the next year. And I feel like Amy McPhee Alabest taught, she wrote Dear Mormon Man and has a podcast breaking down patriarchy. I think for me, marriage in Mormonism, what she talks about is this erasure of women as we get older. And in Mormonism, it happens I felt it so much quicker, of changing my name and not realizing how attached I was to my maiden name, because it felt like the only identity that, people still call me by my maiden name, still call me Fennel, because that's played a lot of sports and I felt very like proud to be a Fennel. And so changing that was like heartbreaking for me. And then having a child, it's just like, I felt like this erasure, and I didn't even know who I was yet, but already being erased and unknown, when now I know my biggest value, my highest value that I hold so highly is to know others and to be known, to understand others and be understood. And I think for a lot of Mormon women, as you get married, as you have kids, those things are, if that's your value, then you won't get that in Mormonism, because you'll be erased.
I've never heard that concept laid out that way, but it is so, so true. And I think that's such a common plight amongst Mormon women as well, but I sense this so strongly amongst ex-Mormon women, where we are just like fighting to get ourselves back, because we feel like we've been erased through all of those things you were saying. And it's so true, having children so early. I mean, regardless of how old you are when you have a child, the amount of sacrifice it requires, particularly on the person carrying the child and birthing the child, that it takes, that's hard for a 35-year-old to handle. And then you think of a 21-year-old, a 22-year-old, when you're still forming your sense of self.
Yeah.
It's
and
just
like
crazy.
Mormon 22-year-old is like real world 17-year-old.
100%. Yeah. With the amount of real world knowledge you have, with the naivete, with the sense of self, because of all those factors we were talking about with decision making. Yes, that is such a powerful and real way to put it. I resonate so much with that. And I had my twins when I was 26 because I had infertility issues. And in retrospect, I think about if I had the twins when I started trying at 23, I can't even imagine how different my psyche would even be right now. Like I have struggled immensely mentally being a mom, and every single year I know has benefited me greatly.
Yeah.
In how long I had to wait because of my infertility and all of that to say, I look back at myself when I was initially trying for kids, and I'm like, I would not have fared very well, I don't think.
Yeah.
So I think that that's such an underspoken about thing of how really, I think, traumatizing it can be to have kids that young. And then, of course, as you're speaking to, there's this added element for you where you're probably all of a sudden reckoning with a lot of things that you hadn't previously.
That I didn't know. Yeah, because we never talked about adoption. For me growing up was, and I think for a lot of people, like in the United States, we like glorify how amazing adoption is and how amazing like adoptive parents are. And I never talked about some of those aspects of like, I want to see somebody who looks like me, but I was obsessed with people who looked like each other, right? In my school, there were these two girls that had the same dad, but different moms. And I was like, oh, that's your sister. They're like, how did you know? It's like, because I can see in your face. Like, it's like people, I can see
you
the
were
connection.
watching for it and sensitive to it.
And they had different colored hair, different colored eyes, not even the same last names. And I was like, oh, that must be your sister. They're like, how do you know? I'm like, well, you're basically a Burnett her. Like,
Because you noticed it.
Yeah.
Wow. How was that? So as you have your first child, a son, right?
Yeah.
Remind me his name.
Nixon.
So you have Nixon. It sounds like you're experiencing some pretty heavy mental health stuff and things like that at that point. How did that intertwine with your faith?
Yeah, because I feel like, I think before you leave Mormonism, you can also experience like nihilistic tendencies when you're depressed,
Totally.
of thinking like nothing else really matters. But I think for me, what hit so hard was this feeling of erasure. And, you have that feeling in the Bible and Book of Mormon. There's no, at this point, I'm wondering, like, somebody help me know how to be a mother, because you told me this would be instinctual. You had told me I would just get it and I would be joyful, but I am not feeling any instinction at all. And part of that was probably because of the biological cutoff of not knowing my own mother, that I felt like I just was a baby myself. I've always felt since the moment my first child was born that I've been incompetent to be a mother. And then at the same time, it was also so empowering to give birth and be like, I did that. I did that on my own without a fucking priesthood blessing.
Yep.
What was that going to do? Like, does that make my vagina get wider or something? Like, how does that help?
Yeah.
And so then when we talk about, like, I feel like I've always been within Mormonism, things, not just in Mormonism, but with my friends who are different faiths, I've always been interested in just what they believe and how they do it and why. I think it's more so I'm interested in human nature than religion itself. But that was always an aspect of, like, when going through the temple, like, part of it was weird to me, but also I was like, like, humans are weird. Like, we do a lot of weird things, ritualistic. And in my head, I was like, well, there's rituals in other religions. I guess this is the ritual we do in ours. But again, going back to the motherhood of it, after you become a mom, your rituals in Mormonism kind of stop outside of going to the temple, whereas men have baby blessings that they're still doing. They're still giving fathers blessings. Like, these rituals, they still get more after. And so for me, it felt like, where are my rituals? And going to the temple now, seeing the creation video showing God and Jesus and Adam creating the world felt like a slap to the absolute face. I was like, how dare you? I felt more like antagonized by the religion now, because I felt like this is a absolute lie, that you would not even give credit to the creators. I have created life. I know what it's like. I've done it twice. And you have no idea what creating life is like. And you want to gatekeep me from this rituals. But I would never do that to my husband or anyone. I would never say you're not allowed in the room to see your son be born. And yet they do that to women in Mormonism. And maybe you don't, and maybe there's some women who don't want to bless their babies. I don't know if I'd want to bless my baby, but where are my rituals for literally repopulating this fucking religion?
Shout it from the rooftops. Wow. Yes. It's erasure again, right? It's like, okay, so we're the ones who are actually doing the fucking thing.
Yeah.
Of bringing these lives to earth, and then we get kicked out of it.
Yeah.
And we get erased, and we get demoted, and we get...
But you still get to teach scouts. You'll never be a scout.
Nope.
But all the women are teaching the scouts.
Yep. And maybe you'll get to hold your baby. Now women are advocating to hold the baby while the baby gets blessed. It's so
not
sad.
enough.
It's not enough. And the way you said that is so powerful. It's so real. It's one of those things too that you get desensitized to.
Yeah.
And I love that you experiencing how absolutely wonderful, but also excruciating it could be to be a mom just kind of threw into relief. Like, this is not okay. And this is not acceptable. And I also was thinking as you were saying that, which I've never thought of it this way, but it makes so much sense that it's almost like, the men of this religion, they can't do what we've done. And so they're trying to control us and erase us.
Yeah.
Intentionally. And it's because women are so powerful, right? And like when we tap into that and realize that, like, we're not going to stick around to be, a lot of us aren't going to stick around to like be controlled and be left out. Like, we're just not going to anymore. And so they're trying so hard, it feels like, speaking from my experience, to get us to like not tap into that understanding. Yeah. And that's what's so tragic.
And I was always raised with a sense of like, this is our religion, right? Like, this works for us. We're all donating our time and money to this religion. So it is what we want it to be, right? But wrong. It is not what you want it to be. And at that time, I was still in that kind of missionary mode of like, I can create this to be what I want it to be, right? I needed at that time women to watch my baby, not to just bring me meals. And I thought, why can't the church like do subsidized daycare at church? Why not get the permits, get the licensure to make this can make a ton of money.
Yeah.
You could even have people outside of the church be able to put their kids in daycare. There's a church building on every corner. And it's like when I'm talking about these ideas because, you know, in my head, I'm thinking like, we're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. So we need to start coming up with these ideas of like how we can start making these changes that will help us.
Yeah. Improve it.
But every which way, when I'm talking about these ideas with people, it's like, I start feeling stupid because it's like, the church doesn't have money for that. The church, like, no, they're not going to get involved in that kind of stuff. They don't want the liability for that.
But they'll send people to foreign countries. Yeah. Excuse me.
Yeah, let's switch it.
Also, people just don't see that it's a problem. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. Like, I think that's part of that phase too of that progressive Mormonism is you're like, a lot of people here, especially the people actually in charge, they don't even think this is a problem. Yeah. And in fact, again, a lot of it is probably intentional. And so it just gets like it feels so smothering. Hopeless and smothering and suffocating, where it's just like, okay, like,
it's like, I'm coming up with all these ideas and like, come on, like, we're the people that put it into action.
Yes.
Right? It's on us and we can do this. Like, let's do this. But at every turn, it's like, that's not a thing. Like, mothers know what's best for their children. Like, you don't need outside help, you know?
Unless it's listening to the prophet who's telling you exactly what to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they're just disregarding our generation, how we're becoming more isolated because we have to work. Like, we don't live in our parents' generation where they were able to live off of one income. And not only that, we want to work too. And maybe there's some people who love staying home with the kids. So let's utilize that.
Totally.
And let's pay them for it, right? Let's pay their household so that even though they get to stay with their babies all day, and they also get paid for that time. And I feel like the more and more I was realizing the realities of like just society in general, like, it's hard to realize that if your husband dies, you have no credit. I wouldn't be able to get a house. I wouldn't be able to get a car at the time. I have no work history. And not even if he just dies, if you get divorced. And then you add the belief aspect onto it of, I really believe that like if he gets remarried and sealed in the temple, that I will be a sister wife.
For eternity.
Yeah. And or if he does die, or God forbid, right, then I would have to remarry and not be able to get sealed in the temple with someone. And it just creates so much confusion around it. And then I met my biological family, and my father had already passed away from alcoholism. And that was also another kick to the gut, because I was like, wait a second, I'm only sealed to my adopted family. I can't be sealed to my biological family. And I know people look at it, and I looked at it as a child of like, beautiful, I'm a part of this family now. But you erased my family of origin. Like, it's not as beautiful now as an adult to me, because don't make me choose between the two.
I didn't even think about that sealing and how it's the ultimate thing, right? You can get brought into this family and sealed and with them forever, But to your point, it's like that's a sealing is kind of exclusive.
Yeah.
And for men, it's not, because men can be sealed to more than one woman.
Yeah.
But as a child, it's like you can't be sealed to two families. Like it's an exclusive thing. And that does erase the family of your origin, your biological family. It makes sense how hurtful that would feel.
Yeah.
And to your point, like you shouldn't have to choose. Like there shouldn't be a heaven where that's how any of this operates anyway.
Yeah. And single parents can't get, my husband was raised by a single mom, so she can't get sealed to her. So it's like, how beautiful actually is this? It's turning more diabolical, you know?
Yep. The more you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have such a powerful way of speaking about all of that. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes, I could ask so many more questions. I just want to ask one final question and bring it back around to adoption, because we were speaking about this at the beginning. You said your views have changed. What would you say, kind of in a nutshell, after, where you're at now, going through it with the faith, and with, it sounds like a huge part of your journey was reconnecting to the power of womanhood, and all of those things considered, where do you feel like your opinion is now on adoption as an adoptee?
Yeah, I really don't like adoption.
Yeah, tell me more.
I don't like closed or open adoption, just because of the legalistic side of adoption is that your old birth certificate, social security number is destroyed, and you get a new birth certificate and social security number with your new adopted family's name on it. So that part of it, I don't like. There's so many other aspects that there's guardianship, kinship, and different ways that like you can still legally take care of a child without, even with that adoption paper, erasing their biological family. And I think part of it is really sad, because what my family needed was time and resources. And with that, they were able, as my mother, as a single mother, to get a degree. And my parents were not together in a relationship, but they both took care of the son that they had together during that time. And so it's sad to me that like I would have wanted to go back. Right? Like if you needed that time, like it's understandable. It's understandable that you don't have everything you need right now, but I would have wanted to be able to still have them in my life and not feel like I'm starting from scratch of really not knowing who I am. Like I wish I would have known those aspects. I'm French Creole. I wish I would have known that growing up. In Mormonism, we do so much genealogy, and it's like that was another thing that was just like a kick to the gut every time, to just not know where you came from. Those things are powerful inside and outside of Mormonism. People do their genealogy just because it's important to know where you come from. And so my views on adoption now is like, obviously it takes a lot to change that, but I think it's adoptees who we should be focusing on, and adult adoptees specifically, because obviously children are not recognizing that. I know it's hard to have those conversations with your kids, and I would say you shouldn't at first. You should go to a therapist and learn how to talk about this stuff with them and take them to therapy so that they can recognize these things that are coming up that they didn't recognize, because I've had to dive into all of the trauma and the pain and, the death of a biological parent who I never knew, who I desperately wish that I would have known. It feels like a part of myself that I will just never know. I'll see through pictures and through what people tell me, but I lost out on a lot. And it doesn't take away from how much I love my family, but I've had to deal with that loss alone as an adult. And I wish I would have been able to have my parents there as a child to help get through these emotions of grief.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that and for teaching me. I feel like I've learned so much about adoption from you, and I'm sure so many people will too. And it's a really important thing, obviously. And I think that you speak so well to the really real implications on your life and on your identity. And I really admire how it seems like you're a very determined person, and it seems like you've worked really hard to find yourself and to piece this puzzle together that, it's a harder thing to do because of what you said. As you said, you still hold space for love and appreciation for your adopted family, but that doesn't discount at all or diminish at all the impacts of it, And I think that these conversations, I can imagine, can be tricky because sometimes it seems like people, it feels like those two things can't exist at once maybe, but obviously they can.
Yeah,
and they
I'm a
do.
Product
yes.
of it, yeah.
And they do, they obviously do. And so I think being able to just be clear about that and straightforward about that is really huge. I wish we could talk for so much longer. I feel like this interview flew by way faster. Yes, you have so much good stuff to share. You went on Mormon Stories, so I can also link that episode because I'm sure people will want to hear more from you. And you just started a podcast of your own.
Yes, I did. So it's called Pouty Mouth, and it's specific more to like adoptees leaving Mormonism and more of the motherhood side of it. I love everything about girls camp, and I feel like I just feel inspired by people like you and Chelsea Homer trying to create community after, and there's so many different aspects to leaving Mormonism, and so I want to talk more about these adoption stories because a lot of people who I know, which I know a lot of adoptees, are no longer Mormon, and so it's super interesting to be like, well, you got raised in this family and yet you're not Mormon when it was supposed to be like what completed our lives and saved us.
Totally.
Yeah.
That like deconstruction element seems super specific, but there's a lot of people who have that super specific experience. Yeah.
And the mental health struggles of it all, because I really have struggled with motherhood and my own mental health. And sometimes it's like, it's hard to understand the lines between what felt like insanity at the time and religion. Like for me, it's hard for me to separate the two.
Same.
And kind of Mormonism has left a little bit of a bad taste for just religion in general for me, which trying to like move past, because I really believe like my kids' spirituality is their own, and I feel like it's my job to kind of show them different aspects, but that's kind of hard when you kind of hate it all at the moment.
Yep. Same. I feel that so deeply, and I'm like, we'll figure it out, right? We're figuring it out. Thank you for the work that you do. I'm so thrilled you're doing a podcast. I think it is a voice that is so needed for so many reasons. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I know you're here in Utah. You're on vacation, you're visiting family. So I just really, really appreciate that you took the time to come onto Girls Camp. Absolutely. I'll make sure that your podcast is linked, your socials, so everyone will know where to find you. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.